All right, David McNair is a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's the executive director of global policy for the One Campaign, and he is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And David, as you know, Carnegie just had to unfortunately close their office in Moscow.
Yeah, it's dark times that we're living through, for sure.
So let's talk about the invasion of Ukraine in the sense that this is creating, according to many experts now, one of the worst disruptions to the supply of wheat since the First World War. And as prices spike, the damage of this shock will ripple right around the world, affecting corn, vegetable oil, fertilizers, many other agricultural products. Over to you.
Thanks, Tina. I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is that Russia and Ukraine together are, in a sense, the breadbasket of the world. They supply together a third of the world's wheat, a quarter of the world's barley. Russia supplies 18% of the world's potash, which is a critical ingredient in nitrate fertilizer. So it's almost like there's a kind of set of dominoes that are kind of falling, and each one is knocking another. So because the immediate exports of those key commodities usually come from ports in the Black Sea, those ports are now closed. So there's kind of spikes on international markets in the immediate term. In the kind of medium term, the planting of wheat is being disrupted because of the war, particularly in Ukraine and the kind of eastern part of the country. And then the long-term impacts for next year's harvest are that this kind of lack of supply of fertilizer is kind of sending the markets kind of haywire, and the implications of this could be quite significant. I mean, the World Food Programme's director David Beasley has said that this could create a food security crisis like nothing that we've seen since the Second World War. The immediate countries that are likely to be affected are those that are highly dependent on those two regions for their staple goods. So Egypt,
let's talk about that, because according to the UN, there are 50 countries that depend on Russia and Ukraine for 30% more of their wheat supply, 30% or more. And many developing countries in Northern Africa, Asia, and the Near East are the most reliant. Which ones stand out to you that are going to be caught in this squeeze?
Well, Egypt is the first one that everyone talks about. 70% of Egypt's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine, and from what I've heard, the country has reserves available until June, and after that, then there's a need for kind of identifying other supplies. Bread is a staple in Egypt. The government already subsidizes bread supply for the population.
Mm-hmm.
And Egypt's also in a lot of debt. So there are discussions about if Egypt has to seek a program from the IMF. One of the conditions of that IMF program might be reforming the wheat subsidies. So you could see a situation like we had in 2009-10, where high prices and high costs of living lead to instability, like we saw with the Arab Spring, and that can then ripple out.
In fact, that is one of the things that started the demonstrations against Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, right? Was the rising food prices, maybe even sugar, I think specifically. But
yeah, exactly. But it's not just Egypt. I mean, there are countries across the Middle East, but even looking down, and I've just got a graph in front of me, which I'll just kind of talk you through. But everywhere from Uganda, Tunisia, Gambia, Senegal, Congo, Rwanda, all of these countries depend on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat. So those costs are going to go up. And the challenge in sub-Saharan Africa is that because poverty rates are so high, families tend to spend a higher proportion of their weekly income on food. Mm-hmm. And that food tends to be, they're not typically buying, meat and vegetables, they're buying basic staples. And these are the staples that are shooting up in price. So the World Bank has suggested that over 90 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty.
I mean, as a result 1919?
No, 90. And what that means is an individual living on less than $1.90 a day.
Yeah, I think when we kick these figures around, I mean, 90 million people could be affected by food shortage. I don't think we realize the scale of that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the kind of immediate impacts is that the humanitarian crises that were already crises that were served by UN agencies like the World Food Programme, serving those populations who are already in food crisis is going to cost a lot more. So we need, countries to step up, donor countries to step up and fund those immediate programs. But the longer term impacts are that this is converging with fiscal positions, particularly in vulnerable countries. That
were already on the tail end of a pandemic. So countries.
That's what I was about to say. So COVID-19 really weakened countries' economies, and those countries, still don't have, by and large, access to vaccination. About 16% of the African population is fully vaccinated. So the pandemic is still a live issue in Africa. You've got the impact of, the hit on tourism, migrant remittances, and about 40% of African countries are in or at high risk of debt distress. So you've got an economic cocktail, and then on top of this, you've got rising energy and food prices, which are going to kind of create more and more challenges. So it's at a family level, with food prices going up for people buying food day to day, but it's also at a kind of country level in terms of the debt sustainability and the impacts and the ability of governments to respond.
But I guess it really depends on whether Ukraine is able to plant. And that's a big question mark right now. But it unfortunately does not seem like this is going to end quickly. So then you have the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, following assessments. They looked at 24 oblasts, which are these big regions inside Ukraine. And it said they were able to do 19, because obviously some of them are directly in a war zone. But it indicated it's uncertain that Ukraine can plant new crops or sustain livestock production, and a huge question mark about whether there'll be any kind of harvest at all.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the planting and the harvest. There is some evidence that Russia has been directly targeting agricultural facilities. So there's the processing that's being, infrastructure that's being damaged. And then you've got, the actual infrastructure to export those crops, at the Black Sea, ports like Odessa and so on. So they would need to be opened up. So, it's not looking like a good situation at all.
So is there an answer here where, obviously long term, we hope that there's going to be some kind of movement towards peace in Ukraine, don't hold your breath in the short term. But is there other countries that can step up, or how do we fill this gap, this critical human gap for people who will not have bread on the table?
So I think there are a few things that can be done. The first is, and there were actually a number of discussions last week at the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank meetings about how countries could respond. So the first thing is do no harm, and that is, both make sure that the humanitarian appeals are funded, but also one thing that countries sometimes do in wake of a food price spike is to impose export bans, and that creates even more volatility in the market, and prices shoot up. Indonesia did it last week with palm oil. But the resisting of those export bans for grain producers is really important.
That's a hard sell, though, isn't it? If I can just jump in there and then I'll let you continue on. That's a hard sell for a country that can anticipate a shortage of palm oil, for instance, and then telling them, well, don't impose an export ban because it's going to make it worse. It's going to make it better domestically for that country, though.
Yeah, I think that's the political challenge. But the issue is that the prices for these commodities are set on international markets, and whenever you have those kind of shocks and shortages, it creates more spikes and then more competition, and that is contagious. So what we saw at the start of the whenever Putin first invaded, Ukraine is the #1 producer of sunflower oil. So the prices started going up on international markets. International buyers then started buying, switching to palm oil. So palm oil started shooting up. Palm oil is a staple in West Africa. So it's not just the direct effects, it's the kind of knock-on effects that occur. And that's what we're trying to avoid, even though it is a politically challenging thing to do, as you've mentioned, because of domestic political pressures. So there's the do no harm part. There's a second kind of basket of responses, which are really about how we support vulnerable countries in their ability to respond and the economic shock of all of this. So the World Bank announced a new initiative about $170 billion worth over the next few years. Now, a lot of that is front-loading existing funding that the World Bank had already programmed, which is the right thing to do, but we need to kind of then, have that, other funding in place. Another thing that the IMF is working on is fiscal support to countries through a mechanism called special drawing rights. This is something that was created at the IMF in the 1960s, basically to help countries respond to shocks. In response to the COVID pandemic, the IMF board created $650 billion worth of IMF special drawing rights. These can be used by countries to shore up their fiscal position.
Special drawing rights?
Yeah. So it's basically an IMF reserve asset, which is valued based on a basket of currencies, and countries, when they're allocated them, can use them to either buy foreign currency, shore up their reserves, or they can exchange them for US dollars to buy vaccines or wheat or whatever it might be. So this is a major injection of capital into the international system, which happened last August. But because of IMF rules, the majority are allocated to, they're allocated on the basis of how many shares a country holds in the IMF. So most went to the richer countries. And now there's a kind of initiative to try and get those richer countries to transfer theirs to vulnerable countries that actually need them.
I would think, otherwise it just creates a larger circle of harm, right? If rich countries are able to draw on those funds more than poor countries, that kind of defeats the whole purpose, doesn't it?
Exactly. So this initiative that the One Campaign has been working on is basically trying to get those rich countries that received about $400 billion worth to transfer at least a quarter of that to vulnerable countries so that they can respond to the shock of both the COVID pandemic, but also the Ukraine conflict. Success
in doing that?
We've got about 40 billion so far. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. But 40 billion is not nothing. It's a pretty significant injection of capital for those vulnerable countries.
Let me ask you the final question, and that is, I'm puzzled by African countries, which are bearing the brunt of the lack of food, and will have the largest crisis in you're already talking about July, right? So I mean it will just get worse and deepen as the year travels on here. Why do you think that African countries were some of the weakest at the United Nations in terms of supporting resolutions against this war and against Russia?
So this is a really interesting development. There were 3 votes, 2 condemning Russia's actions and then 1 to exclude Russia from the Human Rights Council. And in each of those votes, half of the countries that abstained were African. And there are a number of theories behind that. One is just that African countries just don't want to get involved in other people's wars, the non-alignment movement and so on. The second is that African countries see a lot of hypocrisy from NATO. I've heard references to Libya and so on. But the third, and this is really interesting to me, is that because of how African countries were treated by the West during the pandemic, they no longer see the West as a trusted partner. So what we saw during the pandemic was, Europe and North America, monopolized vaccines. African countries, even though they had their own cash, weren't able to buy them because all of the supply had been bought up by Europe and North America. There was meager debt relief, meager economic support. And I think part of what some countries' calculus is that they want to hedge their bets, because if they're going into a kind of potential crisis, extreme vulnerability, they want to be able to turn to China, for economic support. They maybe even want to be able to turn to Russia for military support if they need it. And that's largely because the West has not really supported African countries in the way that they would have expected. So in a sense, if we're kind of moving into a kind of new Cold War scenario, actually the economic support that the West gives to Africa is not just a kind of a moral imperative or a humanitarian issue. It is actually about the alignment of those countries and who they trust in this international configuration.
David McNair, great to talk to you, David. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.